all NFL games should be played on grass fields. It is a joke.
Running and you just fall down. You know, they always say the turf monster got you. Guy reaches up and just grabs your foot or your ankle and knocks you down.
It does not feel the same for an athlete. And it makes you not feel as good while you're playing, and it makes you not feel as good the next day either.
One player is saying he'd rather get struck by lightning than play on turf.
Every year we have the same conversation. A high-profile player suffers a season-ending injury on an artificial turf field, which results in an immediate call from players to ban it in the NFL. And then a few days later, the NFL comes out with some statement talking about how they're looking into it and how player safety is their #1 priority or some nonsense like that. And then nothing happens. But why? I mean, given all the injuries that have happened in the NFL this year, it seems obvious that artificial turf is less safe than natural grass. And the NFL knows this, but they're not actually the ones calling the shots. You see, to fully understand this debate, you have to know there are actually 3 groups involved. The players who want artificial turf changed to grass, the NFL that doesn't want to admit it's wrong, and then there's this third group that actually has all the power, and they're the ones these players need to convince if they want anything changed. But how do they convince them? And what would a solution to this artificial turf and natural grass debate actually look like? Well, first we have to understand what makes artificial turf so dangerous in the first place. Because on the surface, it doesn't seem like there should be much of a difference between playing on turf versus playing on natural grass. If anything, artificial turf should be a better surface to play on since it's more resistant to bad weather, holds up better during a full game, and is more consistent across multiple stadiums. And while that all may be true, it also comes with a huge increase in risk of injury, especially the sort of non-contact lower body injuries like ACL tears that can end a player's season. Now, in order to fully understand the dangers of artificial turf, we have to zoom into an individual blade of grass, specifically the kind of fake grass used by 7 NFL teams before the season. This is called slit film turf, and it's the specific kind of artificial turf that the NFL Players Association president J.C. Tretter called for a ban on in April of 2023. That's because it's designed to have a little opening or slit in every blade of grass, which is meant to increase its durability since that woven pattern is designed to eventually tear apart and get more fluffy over time. But it's actually proven to be incredibly dangerous for NFL athletes to play on. That's because these quick-moving players are getting their cleats caught in those little slits as they run around, leading to more non-contact injuries than on any other type of playing surface. And this claim is actually backed up by a pretty extensive study that both the NFL and the NFL Players Association funded, which shows that more lower body non-contact injuries occurred on artificial playing surfaces than on natural grass between 2018 and 2022. In fact, another study found that between 2012 and 2018, those injuries happened 28% more often on artificial turf, and that players had a 32% higher chance of suffering a non-contact knee injury on turf, and a 69% higher chance of suffering a non-contact foot or ankle injury. Now, these studies compared every type of artificial turf to natural grass. But when you zoom into fields that use slit film turf, studies have found an additional 7% increase in lower body injuries. So why doesn't the story just stop here? I mean, multiple studies funded by the NFL and its players show pretty clearly that playing games on artificial turf fields leads to more injuries than playing on real grass. Well, the true answer to that question lies in the year 2021. Now, like any good league, you'll never get a straight answer from the NFL as to whether or not artificial turf is actually unsafe. And trust me, they've been asked directly hundreds of times by now. But each time they respond with the same old tired answer about wanting to drive down injuries across all playing surfaces, not just artificial turf.
We had 2 ACL injuries, and one was on grass and one was on the turf.
They talk about how they have certain natural grass fields where there's a lower injury rate than artificial turf fields, and how some artificial turf fields actually have a lower injury rate than some natural grass fields. But let's examine that claim for a second. Now, credit to Man Games Lost NFL on Twitter for this, but he charted out all the missed games due to injuries each team has had between 2009 and 2022. And he compared it to the number of wins that team has had during the same time frame. The bigger circles represent more important players being injured, while the smaller circles means the players who got injured weren't very good. Now, you have teams like Washington and Jacksonville who both play on natural grass, yet are among the most injured teams in the league. So, to a certain extent, I guess the league is right. Some grass fields are responsible for more injuries than some artificial turf fields. But don't let the outliers fool you, because when you look at the top 5 most injured teams, 4 of them use artificial turf, and 3 of them, New Orleans, Indianapolis, and New York, all use slit film turf during this time frame. However, the NFL will still use outliers to try and convince you that there is no difference between the two playing surfaces. This is what they did in 2022, when that study they funded showed that in 2021, injury rates on artificial turf and natural grass were nearly identical for the first time in 11 years. And they subsequently went on a PR campaign to say that artificial turf is just as safe as natural grass. Even though the very next year in 2022, the league saw the biggest gap in injury rates between the two surfaces in 8 years. But for Roger Goodell and the NFL, they want to muddy the water. That way they don't actually have to admit they've been on the wrong side of this debate the whole time. But here's the worst part. Even if the NFL wanted to make the change to all natural grass fields tomorrow, they couldn't, because they're not the ones in charge of that decision. You see, basically every NFL stadium is owned by that team's owner, the local government, or some combination of both. But regardless of who owns that stadium, their only goal is to make the most amount of money from that stadium as possible. Just think of the people who own these stadiums less as owners of professional sports teams and more as landlords who want to make sure their property is making them as much money as possible. Because sure, it's nice to own an NFL team, but in the context of these stadiums, those teams are just a tenant who rents out the space 8 to 10 times per year. And what about the other 355 odd days the stadium sits empty? Well, obviously it doesn't. That's because these landlords have gotten really good at filling their stadium schedule with all sorts of events, from concerts to monster truck shows. And the one thing that allows them to jam-pack so many events into a weekend and still host an NFL game on Sunday is this stuff: artificial turf. Because it just wouldn't be possible to have 80,000 people see Bruce Springsteen at MetLife Stadium and then have the Giants play there 3 days later and the Jets play the day after that, all on natural grass. And yes, that's actually a thing that happened in August. Not to mention, turf is much easier to maintain and is far cheaper over the lifetime of the surface. And there's an argument to be made that the additional revenue stadiums make from non-football related activities is actually a good thing for the football teams that play there, since the owners having more money can lead to stadium and facility upgrades that benefit the football team. I mean, do you think that Rams owner Stan Kroenke would have been willing to invest $5 billion of his own money to build SoFi Stadium if he didn't think he could also use it for college football, concerts, and more? Probably not. But the Rams and the Chargers still benefit from those state-of-the-art facilities because of the promise of those other revenue streams outside of NFL football. Not to mention that for most stadiums, it's not just the team's owners that are making the decision on what the playing surface should be. In fact, in most instances, local and state governments have invested hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars into these stadiums, and they want to see them used as places to host things like high school state championships, trade shows, and conventions. So are these local governments and team owners just supposed to give up all of these other events because of an NFL team that only uses the field 10 times per year? Well, actually, yes. And the funny part is that the people that own these stadiums are already willing to do it. That's because when FIFA announced it would be playing the World Cup in North America in 2026, nearly every NFL stadium threw its hat into the ring to host a match. There was just one problem. All international soccer competitions have to be played on natural grass because of the same safety concerns I outlined earlier, but half of the stadiums in the NFL use artificial turf. So what did these stadium owners do? They happily agreed to temporarily change their playing surfaces to be eligible to host a match and cash in on the World Cup coming to America, exposing the one thing NFL athletes have probably been thinking for years: their safety has a price. Because as soon as a good enough opportunity comes along to change the playing surfaces of these NFL stadiums, the owners and local governments were more than willing to do it. But when their own players ask for it, they mumble the same concerns they have for years, like it's not practical, or my favorite, it's too expensive. And that's usually coming from a billionaire. But let's examine these arguments for a second, because if NFL stadiums are willing to switch to natural grass for the World Cup, why couldn't they make the change permanent? I mean, Front Office Sports estimates that it would cost just $12 million to make the change permanent across the league, even in indoor or cold weather stadiums. In fact, Fox 9 in Minneapolis estimates that it would only cost US Bank Stadium, an enclosed dome stadium, an extra $4 to $5 million per year to maintain natural grass indoors. And we already have plenty of examples of cold weather cities with great grass fields, like Green Bay and Denver, which are both consistently rated by players as top 10 playing surfaces in the league. But then there's always the pushback that you couldn't host multiple games a weekend or concerts during the season on grass fields, because then they wouldn't be ready for Sundays, which is a fair concern. So what if we looked at soccer for another solution? Retractable surfaces. We already see these being used in European soccer stadiums, which almost always require playing surfaces be natural grass. In fact, when the NFL plays in Tottenham, England, they're playing on a field with a retractable pitch. Except in this instance, the natural grass soccer field is retracted and replaced with artificial turf for the NFL game. And while this feels like the perfect solution that allows games to be played on real grass and then have that grass be removed and preserved while other events are going on, it's also an insanely expensive process to build out one of these systems. A former NFL team president estimates that it would cost around $50 million to put a retractable field in a new stadium, and hundreds of millions of dollars to put one in an existing stadium. It would also be likely that that stadium would have to shut down for at least one season, something both the league and the owners would probably dislike quite a bit. And unfortunately, the tray solution you see in Arizona and now Las Vegas, where the playing surface is rolled out of the stadium for maintenance and growth, is also not very feasible, with many NFL stadiums being located in tight city centers. Not to mention that the main storyline of the last Super Bowl was how bad the grass was in Arizona, even though it was natural grass grown specifically for the game. So maybe real grass isn't the most practical answer for every team across the league. Fortunately, there is one solution that could be the perfect compromise for everyone involved. It's been found to have no major difference in lower body injuries compared to natural grass, and most new stadiums are already planning on using this surface instead of slit film turf next year. And since it's still considered artificial turf, the NFL doesn't have to admit that it's been on the wrong side of this debate for years. It's called monofilament turf, and notably injury-prone fields like MetLife Stadium and Lucas Oil Field, which both used slit film turf last year, are making the change to this new material. Now, it's great for a few reasons. The first is because it only costs about $1.2 million to install, which takes the owner's complaints about cost out of the equation. The second is because it doesn't have those little loops that players' cleats can get caught on and that cause season-ending lower body injuries. Now, that also means it stands up straighter and acts more like long, uncut grass, which results in a slower playing surface overall. But at the same time, in November of 2022, the NFLPA said that at the very least, it was demanding teams change from slit film to monofilament turf to decrease the chance of injury. And that seems like a change most places are willing to make, since after this year, only one team, the Bengals, will be utilizing slit film turf. But even though this is a compromise, it's still not giving players what they want. For example, Colts players have talked about the dangers of playing on their home turf field, and even though the team is making the change to the safer monofilament turf next year, players still note how they're essentially playing on a concrete pad. Every sharp turn in the ground sends shockwaves through their body and joints, and hits to the turf take more of a toll on their body than landing on natural grass. So what are the odds the change players really want really gets made, where each field is a natural grass surface? Well, I think former NFL executive Andrew Brandt sums it up best.
When there's an ACL and Achilles, especially to a star player, we ramp up the discussion about turf fields versus grass fields. Is it safer on grass? I would think so, sure. Are owners going to change to grass? No. Okay? So the owners, if you haven't learned anything about the business of sports, and I would think the NFLPA and all the players, of course know this. The owners are not doing anything because it's the right thing to do. The owners are not doing anything out of the kindness of their hearts. The owners are not going to change fields at a significant cost just because. If that was the case, this would have happened a long time ago. And MetLife Stadium, where the Giants and Jets play, would not have turf.
And he's right. There is a clear price owners and local governments are willing to pay to have safer fields for their players. And at this point, the cost of losing players isn't higher than the cost of losing concerts, college football games, and soccer matches. But at the same time, we also know that the NFL isn't rushing to make the switch mandatory, because if they did, then they'd be admitting that for the last 50 years, they've been knowingly putting their players at an increased risk of injury, something that didn't turn out so well for them last time. But eventually, I think there will be a tipping point where athletes are making so much money and teams are losing so many good players to injury that owners will have no choice but to protect their most expensive assets. However, until then, it seems like monofilament turf is as good as these players are going to get. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave some feedback in the comments. I read them all. And if you like this video, make sure to go check out one of my other sports business deep dives.